From the beginning, Adrian Turner had always appeared to be a man of deep feeling, the kind of husband who carried the weight of devotion in every gesture, the kind who seemed incapable of indifference. That was the illusion I lived with for years, until one day it shattered so violently that I could no longer deny the truth. He had seen Melissa Cruz just once in my presence, and in the days that followed, he drove his car toward me with reckless fury, as though to prove a point to both of us. I remember the chill in my veins as I asked him through trembling lips if he truly cared for her that much. His answer was a blade to my chest. He said she could stand in front of a knife for him. But what about me? The implication was brutal and final. My laugh came out cracked and hollow, a sound that did not belong to the woman I used to be. It was clear. He did not believe I would ever die for him, and perhaps he was right. For months he had hidden her behind my back. For half a year he had carved out a secret life while I remained blind or perhaps willfully ignorant. I had mistaken his distance for the fatigue of marriage, for the heaviness of work. Only a week ago his mask slipped and the truth began to bleed into the surface. It was during my cycle when he asked with a strange softness why I never seemed to suffer cramps. His words cut through me because they did not belong in our marriage. They belonged to someone else's pain. I froze, and in that second, I knew he had been paying attention to another woman's body, another woman's suffering. I forced a smile, pretended it was nothing, and said lightly that old remedies and medicine had cured me long ago. He looked at me with a face as still as stone, his heart beating, without disturbance, and only muttered a faint acknowledgement. 3 days later, I was on a plane leaving the country, and he was here in Salem sheltering her. The photo that reached me while I was away was grainy. Blurred her face almost invisible, but the tenderness in his posture was undeniable. The way he leaned toward her, the way his hand hovered protectively, spoke volumes more than any confession. I had always suspected he could stray, but what stunned me was the depth of care he showed her, a devotion that seemed to exceed anything he had ever given me. Who was she, this girl, who could pull such warmth from a man who had grown so cold to me? The curiosity was corrosive. I returned in secret without a word to him, arranging for a car to take me straight to the apartment where he kept her hidden. Fate timed it cruelly. Just as we pulled up, I saw Adrian stepping down from his sleek car, stripping off his tailored jacket and shoving it into the back seat. He slipped on a cheap hoodie, pushed glasses over his eyes, tousled his hair into something deliberately careless, and slung a laptop bag over his shoulder. I almost laughed out loud. My husband, the polished executive, playing at being an ordinary young programmer just to blend into her world. When he disappeared upstairs, I told the driver to wait. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle. Fear tried to hold me back, but anger pushed me forward. What could he do? Kill me for exposing the truth? We both knew that once I walked into that apartment and confronted them, there would be no path back, no forgiveness left to bargain for. For 2 years, our marriage had been rotting, eaten alive by silence and rage. Arguments had become routine nights of Cold War, had stretched into weeks, and objects had been smashed in our home until the sound of shattering glass felt ordinary. Only 2 weeks earlier, a fight had ended with his hand colliding with my face, not because he could not avoid me, but because he chose not to. Blood had trickled warm and metallic down my temple while he stared at me with eyes stripped of all softness. He had asked with disdain if there was anything left of the woman I used to be. I had laughed through the sting. Of course there wasn't. And yet his changes were natural, inevitable, while mine were seen as unforgivable. I knocked on the apartment door. When it swung open, Adrian stood there, a smile that looked practiced stretched across his lips. He glanced back into the room and said gently that he would handle it. But the moment his eyes locked on mine, the warmth drained, replaced by a frost that spread over his face with stunning speed. It was like watching an actor drop one mask and replace it with another in a blink, as though he had trained at the finest drama school. Then came the voice that did not belong to me or him. "Who's that?" A young woman, petite and delicate, peeked out from behind his shoulder with wide, curious eyes. My breath stalled. This was her. This was Melissa. Adrian shifted his body to block her, commanding in that low voice of his that she go back inside. She hesitated, confused her innocence, almost painful to watch. I smiled, a slow, bitter curve on my lips. Stepping forward, I extended my hand toward her. "Hi," I said with deliberate calm. "I'm Adrian's colleague. We have some work matters to discuss." He shot me a glance, offering no denial, allowing my lie to stand. He told her to stay home, that he and I would talk outside. I tilted my head and mocked, gently asking if I had disturbed Mrs. Turner. Her cheeks flamed red, and she shook her head quickly, stammering that she was not his wife, that they were not married. I raised my brows, let a light laugh escape, and said perhaps, soon they would be. She looked at him shyly, her blush deepening, and my smile grew sharper. "Well then," I continued sweetly, "when the day comes, I'll be expecting a glass of champagne at your wedding." The poor girl ducked her head flustered, and he looked away as if ashamed, yet unwilling to correct the illusion. Finally, I asked for her name. She said softly, "Melissa Cruz. 19 years old, a college student with top grades, a girl of good reputation and unblemished character." I had already learned these details before confronting her, but hearing them from her lips cut deeper than I expected. She was everything I no longer was. Everything he seemed to crave, and in that moment, I knew the storm I had stepped into would not end with just this encounter. Adrian kept the rest of his secrets buried so deeply that I could never step fully into the house he shared with her. Under the frozen stare he gave me outside that door, a gaze so cold it seemed to pierce bone, I forced myself to follow him back down the stairs. He lit a cigarette the moment we reached the street, dragging in the smoke with a sharp hiss, before asking how I had come back, why I had not told him I was returning to Salem, how long I had known about Melissa. His voice was low and threatening, as he demanded to know what I wanted from him. I laughed, brittle and bitter. Finally, we were at the part that mattered. What did he think I should want? He tilted his head, eyes scanning me like a predator testing his prey, and muttered that his relationship with her was not as filthy as I imagined. She was frail, he said, and he was only taking care of her. That was all. I answered with a single dry sound, a short, "Oh," that carried all my disbelief. And if I said I did not believe him, his expression darkened instantly. The mask of softness he sometimes wore stripped away in a heartbeat. I pushed open the car door and slammed it shut with a crack that echoed off the building walls. He called my name sharply, but before I could turn, a roar ripped through the air. The engine of his car thundered as he gripped the wheel. With one hand, his eyes locked on me without wavering. The vehicle lurched forward, closing the distance between us in seconds. My body froze, my breath caught terror, seared every nerve as the hood came within inches of my knees. Tires shrieked, the car shuddered, and then it stopped. My mind was blank, deafened by a sound like thunder exploding inside my skull. He reversed slowly, turned the car, and rolled to a stop beside me. He leaned his head toward the window and spoke in a voice that was nothing like a plea, only an icy warning. "Don't touch her!" The driver who had brought me old Mr. Hughes stumbled forward in horror, his face pale, his voice trembling as he asked if I was all right. In that instant, when my legs gave way and I nearly collapsed against the curb, I realized it had not been an illusion. He had truly wanted to hit me, to crush me under his wheel. Adrian Turner had never been a good man. A boy who never even finished middle school, who clawed his way into wealth and power, could only have done so through cruelty, not only toward others, but toward himself. Memories came flooding back in jagged fragments. He had been 6 when my father, reckless and selfish, had dragged me along on one of his sordid escapades. He left us in the living room while he disappeared into a bedroom. With his mistress, the air soon thick with sounds I was too young to understand. I had turned to Adrian, wide-eyed and curious, asking what they were doing. He turned the television volume up, Tom and Jerry, filling the room with frantic music, and pressed his hand gently but firmly over my ears. "Dirty," he whispered, "don't listen." He was only 7 a year older than me, yet already he had learned to shield me from filth, not because of love, but because his mother had promised him $100 of allowance each week if he kept me happy. That was the beginning. At 14, my father ran off with his mother, leaving our lives scorched in more ways than one. My own mother, consumed by rage, set fire to the house. Adrian had carried me out of the flames on his back, his arm seared so badly that the scars never faded. He could not afford to return to school. I once smashed his family's belongings with a baseball bat, in childish fury, a tantrum that cost him $20,000 in damages. He still did not go back to classes. Instead, he traveled down to the mountains of the Pacific Northwest, buying herbs and local goods to resell. The first money he ever earned, he spent on me. A princess dress that made my 15-year-old heart flutter, even while I knew my mother would scream. And scream she did. She shouted that I was betraying her by clinging to the son of the woman who had stolen my father, that I carried my father's shame in my veins, that she should have strangled me at birth. I should have stood by her, but how could I, when the only hands that had ever steadied me belonged to Adrian? While my father was busy chasing women, and my mother was drowning in jealous rage, I lived like an orphan in my own home. Adrian was the one who made sure I ate, who shielded me from beatings, who told me I must remain clean, even if he was covered in dirt. He could be bruised black and blue, but no one was allowed to lay a finger on me. He never let me tell anyone of our connection, terrified he could not protect me if the world knew. What he feared most was my tears. He would clumsily wipe them away, scolding me to stop crying, his hands shaking as he tried to comfort me. Yet when I finally grew strong enough not to cry anymore, he was not pleased. He almost sounded wounded when he told me I should have kept sobbing, making scenes, because he would have given in to me every time. Why, he asked, did I have to grow so hard, so unyielding against him? Later, when I lay in the hospital after collapsing, It was Charles Hartman, an old friend turned doctor, who urged me to rest another day. I shook my head, demanding cigarettes instead. The hospital forbade smoking, he reminded me gently, but I only laughed without humor. If quitting were so easy, I would rather die than suffer the attempt. He rolled his eyes, exasperated, unwilling to argue with me further. As I stared at the ceiling of that sterile room, the weight of years pressed down on me. Adrian Turner had once been my savior, my companion, the boy who shielded my ears from shame and carried me from fire. But now he was the man who gripped a steering wheel with murder in his eyes, the man who told me never to touch the girl he cherished. The contrast ripped me apart, leaving me hollow, leaving me wondering if every kindness had been only another transaction, another step on his ruthless climb. And yet even then, even broken and betrayed, a part of me could not stop remembering the boy with burnt arms who once gave me a dress and told me not to cry. People kept asking what exactly had happened between Adrian Turner and me. Normally, if I so much as hinted that I was upset, he would rush in, smooth everything over, and fix whatever needed fixing. But this time I lay in a hospital bed, and he never once appeared at my side. I laughed quietly when the question was raised, a cold sound that made clear I had been waiting for someone to finally speak aloud what everyone sensed. Perhaps they had been holding it in for too long. I was preparing to leave the hospital when Ethan Ward came barreling down the hall, almost colliding with me in his frantic haste. His eyes were wide with panic, his face pale as paper. He stammered, asking if I was hurt, if Adrian had done something unforgivable, if I wanted him to make Adrian pay. None of his questions were the ones I wanted to hear. I lashed out with my foot, kicking his shin, and he took it without flinching, bowing his head and leaning closer as if inviting punishment. He whispered an apology voice, small and desperate. I patted his head lightly, asking if Charles Hartman had told him the truth. He shook his head and admitted he had investigated on his own. The boy was growing sharper with every year, more capable than I sometimes realized, bold enough now to dig into matters I had tried to shield from him. I asked about his work down south, and he said his partners could handle it, but he could not keep from coming back. I laughed, exasperated, and touched all at once, calling him too clever for his own good. He trailed behind me like a shadow, murmuring apologies as we walked the corridor together. Yet the moment we stepped into the lobby, Adrian was there in full view, standing calmly with Melissa Cruz's hand locked tightly in his. There was no pretense anymore. He made no attempt to hide it, no effort at explanation. Ethan froze for several seconds, then rage broke across his face, and he started forward, fists clenched, but I shoved him back before he could make a scene. Charles stood stiff as a statue to the side, his complexion shifting between ashen and flushed, uncertain how to respond. It was Melissa's soft, hesitant voice that cracked the silence. She asked gently if I was all right. I smiled at her, told her it was nothing serious, then asked about her. She blushed, admitted she had a scar she wanted to have removed, and I nodded as if enlightened, assuring her that modern medicine could erase such a flaw easily. For someone so young and beautiful, I said it was natural not to want any blemishes. Her face turned redder as she insisted I too was beautiful. Adrian's grip on her hand tightened, his jaw hard. He murmured that they needed to leave, that a specialist was waiting, and Melissa offered me a polite farewell with the same detached courtesy one might give a colleague. It was as if we were nothing more than acquaintances, our parting no different from a nod across a boardroom. On the way back, Ethan's expression was dark, carved in stone. I teased him, asking if he had truly intended to fight Adrian. If I had not stopped him, he snapped that of course he had. I reminded him that Adrian once terrified him, asked if he was no longer afraid. He hesitated but pressed on, urging me to cut Adrian out of my life once and for all. I snorted, calling him a foolish child. The truth was, Ethan had not been born into my life. I had found him on a freezing winter night when I was 20, abandoned in the stairwell by his father and stepmother. He was 11, shivering in a thin spring jacket, his small body covered in bruises. He clutched at my pant leg and whispered that he was hungry. I took him home boiled noodles, added a sausage, and watched him eat like a starved stray. At the time, Adrian and I were locked in another of our endless battles. He wanted me to stay out of his dangerous affairs, to focus on my studies, but I could never bear the sight of his injuries or the way a few dollars could buy or break a man's life. Eventually, I yielded to my mother, promising her I would sever ties with Adrian and return to manage the family estate. She sneered, but knew as well as I did that the inheritance from my grandparents could only pass through me. She despised me, yet needed me, and when she could not control me, she resorted to recording my words and sending them to Adrian. He did not believe her manipulations. He trusted me, and for that very reason, he blamed himself more harshly than ever. He berated himself for not protecting me, for not shielding me from every blow, and his guilt poisoned everything between us. Arguments flared constantly, first about practical matters, then about feelings, then about everything in between, followed always by reconciliation that never lasted. We fought, we made up, we fought again. Ethan became an unplanned part of that cycle. I raised him in fits and starts over 6 months, giving him food, shelter, and care when I could. Adrian paid him no attention, neither approving nor forbidding, but his coldness terrified the boy. He would shrink back whenever Adrian entered the room, flinching at his silence. When Ethan's father finally discovered where his son had been spending his nights, his eyes crawled over me with a lechery so foul it made my skin crawl. Ethan must have overheard something in that man's tone, because soon after he scraped together every penny he had left to buy a knife. He was only a child, trembling with fear and desperation, clutching that blade as if it were his only lifeline. And I standing between the boy I had taken in and the man who had once saved me from flames, but now held another girl's hand as if she were the only one that mattered, wondered how many more years I could keep pretending the ground beneath us had not already given way. I cooked Ethan a bowl of noodles, slid the knife out of his shaking hand, and told him he had nothing to fear as long as I was there. I had no idea that same night his father would follow me home. The man forced his way inside, tore at my clothes, and threw me against the bed with a violence that stole the breath from my lungs. Just as terror began to paralyze me, the woman he had brought with him burst through the doorway. They screamed at each other, clawing like animals, and in the chaos, he plunged the blade into her stomach. Blood sprayed her eyes wide with disbelief before she crumpled, and he panicked, bolted from the house, scooping every dollar from my safe on his way out. He thought he had escaped, but I had only just installed a new camera. Every second of his crime was recorded, and within days, the police arrested him. The court sentenced him to years behind bars. At that time, I thought it was the perfect plan, a brutal but fitting resolution to a man who had haunted Ethan's childhood. Adrian said nothing when he found me later. He only cleaned my scrapes and dabbed medicine onto the bruises. His silence cut deeper than words, until finally he muttered that I should never have used myself as bait. His voice cracked as he asked what he would have done if something had happened to me. That was the sentence I kept carved into my memory, the one that seemed like proof he still cared. Yet there was another phrase spoken so quietly I pretended not to hear, until years later when it replayed endlessly in my head. "Filthy," he whispered. "Go take a shower." That night, he came home to find me sitting in the living room, a book in my lap, the lamp glowing soft and patient. He asked why I had not gone to bed, though we both knew the answer. I was waiting for him, and he knew I always would. He knew the way I knew that he would always come back no matter how late, no matter with whom. My certainty did not come from faith, but from files I had read in secret Melissa Cruz's medical records. His hand paused on the keys he was dropping onto the table. He unbuttoned his coat, lowered himself into the chair across from me, and asked with unnerving calm what I wanted to discuss. His composure made me want to scream. I stared at him until I finally said what had been burning in my chest, that I could tell Melissa everything, reveal the truths he had buried. His head lifted, his eyes slicing into me with a glacial fury. "I told you," he said, "do not touch her. And if I want to..." I pressed, "Will you run me down with your car again, only this time without pressing the brakes?" His lips curled into something between a smile and a snarl. "I will never hurt you, Madeline, but there are many others I could touch." The threat was not shouted, not even spoken loudly, but it landed heavier than any blow. I rose, my book slipping from my fingers to the floor with a dull thud. I picked up the baseball bat that leaned against the couch. "I will not lay a hand on her," I said, "but you must choose. An arm or a leg." Adrian stood as well, meeting my gaze without flinching. For a long moment we faced each other, the room silent except for our breathing. Then he extended his left arm steady and resolute. Without hesitation, I swung. The crack of bone breaking echoed through the room, his face blanching as sweat broke across his brow. He bit down on his pain and looked straight at me, forcing out each word. Satisfied now, I told him to get out. He clutched his shattered arm and staggered toward the door. Before he crossed the threshold, I could not stop myself from asking, "Do you really love her that much?" He did not hesitate, not for a second. "She would take a knife for me," he said. "Would you?" The room collapsed into silence. My body locked in place, rigid, my mind replaying his words. He turned back once more, his face ashen, lips trembling, as though he wanted to say something different, but all I could do was laugh bitterly, lean back into the chair, and let sarcasm coat my tongue. Of course not. I had already learned the truth. Melissa's back bore a scar, long and jagged from shoulder to hip, the mark of the blade she had intercepted for him. That had been early last year when Adrian launched into a reckless business war, with me willing to lose thousands of his own, if only it meant I lost 800 more. He ignored my calls, refused every meeting, vanished without explanation, until rumors swirled that he had been attacked and whispers spread that I had ordered it. The absurdity made me laugh until tears burned my eyes, furious and amused in equal measure. I spent a week unraveling the truth and dragged the real culprit to Adrian's doorstep. He sat in silence for a long time before covering his face with his hand and muttering that it had been his fault, that he had been blind and foolish. Did I think that was when our trust began to crumble? He asked the question gently, but I did not answer. I only stared ahead and said nothing. Adrian had appeared at my elementary school years ago, seemingly by chance, but I knew now it had been orchestrated. I asked him outright if his family had arranged it, and he admitted they had. "To charm you, of course," he said. His mother wanted power, and to climb she needed to secure every rung of the ladder. She had said often that he was a clever boy, a boy who could adapt to anyone, even the devil himself. And so he had been placed in my life not as a miracle, not even as a choice, but as part of a scheme. The weight of that revelation pressed against every breath I took, twisting all our years together into something poisoned, a script written by someone else. And yet, even with his broken arm cradled against his chest, with his betrayal laid bare, he remained the man whose absence hollowed me, and whose presence destroyed me. Adrian had always been able to bend people to his will if he chose. That was the truth that haunted me, even as I remembered the days when he tied my shoelaces, chased away the fat boy who bullied me, and carried me home on snowy afternoons when my legs were too tired to go further. He would eat scraps off the floor, but save the only piece of chocolate for me. I can still see him in my memory, a cigarette clamped between his lips, narrowing his eyes against the sunlight, his silhouette etched in smoke. My father's voice drags me back from that reverie. He smirks, reminding me of how I used to leave the house every day with bags of food and fruit, pretending to visit neighbors, but really bringing everything to Adrian. Since that boy had clung to me, he said Adrian no longer needed to charm the old women around the block to survive. My father laughed as though it was all a joke, as though he had uncovered some secret of my childhood. I had heard enough. I rose, intending to leave, but he called after me, demanding more money. "Wait until next month," I answered coolly. His face darkened immediately. "I am your father," he barked. That was the excuse he wielded every time he wanted to guilt me into supporting him. Every month I sent him living expenses, even when I barely had enough to eat myself. The inheritance my grandparents had left was meant for me, but he sneered that I had no right to it while he still lived. "If you don't send more," he threatened, "I'll return to the States." I smiled sharp and thin. "The moment you step off the plane," I said, "I'll have you arrested." His jaw clenched, his teeth grinding, his eyes burning with malice. Then he smiled cruel and knowing. "Do you know why?" he asked. "When his mistress left Adrian's mother, she never left him a dime. Because Adrian said he liked you, because he swore he would never calculate or take from you. And if he stayed loyal to you, she would never have a chance to climb higher, never a chance to marry into wealth." She had sneered at him, reminding him that he thought he was clever, and thrown him a single dollar to prove he could survive without her. "Stubborn boy," my father said, never willing to plead, never willing to utter a single weak word. For a moment, my face darkened, shadows covering every feature. "Congratulations!" I told him. "Next month, you lose half your allowance." On the flight back, I said nothing, my mind twisted into knots. Ethan sat beside me, anxiety written across every line of his face. He asked why I always left in such a foul mood, after seeing my father, why I still met with him at all. Why, indeed? At first, even I had not known. Only later did I understand. What I wanted, what I sought in every bitter meeting, was not reconciliation. It was proof. I wanted him to confirm that every kindness Adrian had shown me, had been false, that the reason Adrian no longer loved me was because he never had. My father laughed, spitting vulgarities, calling me blind in love. I cut his allowance in half that month, too. This man was my father, the one who had run off with Adrian's mother years ago. My mother had been another kind of fool, blind in her way, convinced of true love. Even after my father abandoned her for another woman, she continued to deposit money into his account each month. She worked tirelessly, running the family company, maintaining the estate with her own hands until the effort consumed her. She fell ill, refused treatment, and when death came, she left behind only a single message. "Forgive him," she wrote, "forgive him, and you will forgive yourself." My father had only laughed. Crazy, he called her. They had never been in love, only in an arranged marriage. If she had refused, her family would have cut her off financially. Even my birth had been the result of artificial insemination, nothing more than a transaction. To him, she was a background character, nameless, faceless, useful only for the money she handed over. Watching him live so comfortably on what she had sacrificed burned me alive. The month she died, I cut off his allowance entirely. He raged, shouted curses, declared I would meet a miserable end, insisted I had damned her soul to restless wandering. I only laughed. If she could not rest, then it was only what he deserved. By the second month without money, Adrian's mother abandoned my father, as well leaving him for someone wealthier. Years ago, he had discarded his first mistress, Adrian's mother, to marry mine when his family cut off his funds. Now, history repeated itself. For the sake of a few dollars, she abandoned him. I almost applauded at the spectacle. Let them devour each other. Let them reap the ruin they had sown. As the plane cut through clouds above the country I had tried so long to claim as home, Ethan's hand hovered near mine, hesitant, wanting to comfort, but not knowing how. My chest felt hollow, my mind circling back always to Adrian, to the way my father's words had poisoned even the purest memories, to the endless tug-of-war between loyalty and betrayal. The theater of our families had always been grotesque, but in that moment it struck me as almost poetic. The men who thought themselves powerful were nothing more than beggars clinging to women's purses. The women who thought themselves strong were consumed by men who drained them dry. And I, sitting in the middle, laughed quietly to myself, knowing I would survive them all. I told Adrian there was only one rule left between us, that he must never return to the country, and after that I called him. It took him a long time to answer, his voice rough and worn with exhaustion when he finally did. I spoke first, telling him I had cleared the furniture from the mansion and set it out on the lawn. He could send someone to collect it. I informed him that I had drafted the dissolution papers for the company we had invested in together, that I would email them shortly, and he should respond quickly. His silence stretched longer than it had the last time. Was it necessary, he asked, and I rubbed my temples, lowering my voice as I said, we should cut everything clean. The next time I saw him, his arm was bound in plaster slung around his neck. Melissa Cruz was beside him as always. Charles Hartman murmured that though my blow had been hard, it had been precise lucky that it would not affect Adrian's life forever. I only shrugged and said it was a pity. Charles glared at me, calling me cruel, but I thought cruelty was only what Adrian deserved. We divided our assets with icy calm. I signed paper after paper, stamped seal after seal, until my hands moved without feeling my heart numb to the weight of it. Ethan draped my coat over my shoulders and pressed a glass of water into my hand. When I lifted my head, I saw Melissa lingering timidly nearby. I nodded at her and started to leave, but she called after me, her voice trembling. I answered flatly, expecting Adrian, but she said it was her who wished to speak. Ethan frowned, blocking her path, but she straightened her back and insisted. I sighed, touched Ethan's shoulder, and let her speak. She bit her lip, eyes wet, and told me she had not known the truth of our relationship, that she was sorry. She said no one had ever treated her as well as Adrian had, and that she could not let go. She bent in a 90-degree bow, her voice steady even as it shook. I sidestepped, unwilling to accept her apology. "You don't need to do that," I said. "Whatever you and he share has nothing to do with me, just as whatever I once had with him has nothing to do with you." Behind me, Adrian leaned against the wall, a cigarette at his lips, his face blank, listening to every word. People assumed Melissa was the reason Adrian and I fell apart, but they were wrong. Our rift was deeper than her. It was a matter of principles of distance that had widened into a canyon of fractures that had spread until the foundation collapsed. Some refused to believe it. They whispered that once he would have died for me. Adrian exhaled smoke eyes, indifferent, and said he had forgotten. We separated without theatrics, without shouting quietly enough to stun those who had known how possessive I had once been. In the past, I would have driven away any woman who dared stand too close to him. But now I let go, stepped aside, and watched others test how far they could push. The more I seemed not to care, the bolder they became. Melissa had no idea how to handle it. When strangers flirted with Adrian at parties, she would flee to the hallway to cry alone. Once, when I walked out, she was wiping her tears, frantically pretending composure. I ignored it and kept walking, but she ran after me. At first, I intended not to respond, but then she collapsed suddenly, clutching her chest, her face pale with pain, as if she could not breathe. I shouted, called for help, dialed Adrian. He came rushing, pressing a pill into her mouth, until her body slackened and she drifted into unconsciousness. She had been born with a weak heart, her health fragile since childhood. It did not concern me deeply, but still the bitterness in me rose. I told him he wanted her to remain innocent forever, yet could not protect her from anything, and wasn't that amusing? The night cloaked his expression, so I could not see it, and I turned away, unwilling to look longer. In the car, Ethan kept watching me through the rearview mirror, hesitant. I told him to speak. He asked softly if it was true that I did not hate Melissa, if his instincts were wrong. I exhaled, fogging the window, and said she reminded me of myself long ago. He shook his head firm, declaring that she was nothing like me. I laughed low and sharp. "What do you know?" I asked. "She is like me, the me, before I found you." Back then, I was naive to the point of foolishness, ignorant of the world, believing that sitting with Adrian over a shared bun was enough to be happy. We lived in a cramped little house where the socket by the bed was broken, and mice often crept out from the hole, scampering across my feet until I sobbed in terror. Adrian mixed cement, sealed the socket, and with what was left, he molded a small flower pot just for me. I planted strawberries in it and tended them carefully every day, waiting for fruit that never came, because before the season arrived, he was beaten by a group of men in an alley. He shouted for me to run, to never look back, but instead I threw myself in front of him and took a blow meant for his head. Charles later told me Adrian nearly killed a man that night, that if he had gone through with it, his entire life would have ended behind bars. It was the first time I felt real fear, the first time I began to wonder what I could possibly give him in return. I did not want to cower behind him anymore. I wanted to protect him the way he had always shielded me. Perhaps that was the beginning of everything. Or perhaps it was the end of something we had never named. On the anniversary of my mother's death, I set aside all work, bought a bouquet, and went to the cemetery early. My feelings for her had always been complicated. As a child, I barely saw her, and when I did, she never showed affection. The housemaid once whispered that looking at me reminded her of my father, so she buried herself in work to forget. I never saw her happy, not once. Even when she was dying, she never looked at me directly. I had hated her, resented her, despised her distance, but the dead are like extinguished lamps. In the end, the emotions vanished like smoke. I laid the flowers on her grave and found a clean spot to sit. "What did you see in him?" I asked aloud. "He had no talent, no virtue, just a face. You must have loved the wrong man. Next time, choose someone who truly loves you, and if you have a child, love them better." I muttered like that until I lost track of my words, even dozed off for a moment. When the sun tilted west, I stood, brushed the dust from my clothes, and left. Ethan opened the car door and I leaned my head against the window. "Don't stay with me forever," I told him. "Do what you want, even if you choose me. You must first be yourself. If you live only as my shadow, none of this means anything." He was silent a long time before answering sadly. "All right." Life passed quietly after that. When Adrian called me one evening, I felt a flicker of unease. I could hear his heavy breathing, but he said nothing. "If you don't speak," I said, "I'll hang up." Then his voice broke through. "Madeline, Mrs. Chu is gone." The news struck me like a stone to the chest. Mrs. Chu had lived below Adrian's old apartment. In the years his mother neglected him, and he starved, she had fed him, given him a bed, mended his clothes. Later, even when he was grown, he always brought her small gifts on holidays and sat to chat with her. People said he was grateful, and I thought so too, until I realized he saw her as the only real family he had. She was his shelter, his last fragile root. Now that root was gone. What would he be now, frightened, lost? I could not find words, only whispered my condolences. That night I did not sleep. I had met Mrs. Chu a few times, an irritable woman, a little stingy. She sometimes slapped Adrian's arm, suddenly scolding him for smoking. "Can't you quit? Do you want to suffocate me?" She would bark, and he would suck in a cold breath, muttering that she was impossible. In her presence, he always seemed younger, softer, like a boy caught stealing cookies. She had been a barrier between us and death itself, convincing us somehow that it was still far away. But now she was gone and the barrier was shattered. Confronted with loss, even I felt unmoored. Before dawn, my phone rang. Charles's voice urgent on the other end. He didn't wait for me to get angry, he rushed his words. "Adrian is missing. Have you heard from him?" "Mrs. Chu has died. You know that, right?" I murmured that I knew. My throat tight and stared at the ceiling as if answers could be carved into plaster. Charles sighed with relief on the phone, as though he had expected me to know something. I could hear noise in the background, what sounded like Melissa crying, and then Charles moved to a quieter place. "Did he say anything to you about where he was going?" "He asked Adrian is not well, and we are all worried." "He didn't say a word to me," I answered. Then do you know where he might have gone? His question froze me until I pulled the blanket aside, stepped from the bed, and opened my door. At that very moment, Adrian collapsed inside without warning. His brows were drawn tight, his lashes quivered, but his eyes stayed shut, his face flushed with unnatural heat. He was burning with fever. I pressed the phone to my ear, my voice low and steady. "He's here. Come take him." They arrived quickly. Charles first. Melissa trailing pale and fragile behind him. Her gaze, when it met mine, was layered too many things tangled together. In the end, she only gripped Adrian's hand and left without speaking. Charles, dramatic as ever, wiped imaginary sweat from his forehead and lifted a thumb at me. "You're incredible, letting him lie on the floor with a broken arm." I didn't react. "Get out too," I said flatly. He laughed and agreed, and that night was never mentioned again. Adrian's sudden appearance felt like a hallucination. When we crossed paths later, we carried ourselves like strangers. Charles remarked that I was made of stone, that years of love had been discarded without hesitation, that a woman like me feared nothing and could accomplish anything. "You're too free with your judgments," I told him, but he only smiled and shifted to business. The hospital was organizing a mobile clinic in the mountains and needed funding. Would I consider it? After a pause, I said yes, my staff would handle it. He thanked me as their sponsor, then added that I might enjoy going along the mountains were fresh, and the people honest, the air clean and calming. For a moment, I felt warmth, and admitted that perhaps I should leave the city for a while. That evening, after a business dinner, the youngest son of Mr. Trin offered to drive me home. He was barely 20, his every thought written openly on his face. I could not politely refuse, so I accepted. On the drive, he searched for topics, but I gently deflected each one. At my door, he looked disappointed, asking if I thought him too young. I laughed. "You are too young." I told him what you feel now is fleeting. It will come quickly and vanish just as fast. "Thank you for tonight. Goodbye." He puffed his cheeks in childish frustration and walked away, but after a few steps, he spun back and hugged me tightly. Quick and desperate before releasing me just as fast. "Don't thank me," he said goodbye. I stood stunned until his car disappeared, and then I only sighed. The next morning, I heard he had been beaten. Men had stopped his car, thrown a sack over his head, and pummeled him until his bones must have ached for days. He was not seriously injured, but the humiliation burned. Mr. Trin was furious, swearing to find the culprits and punish them. On my desk, a photograph from a surveillance camera showed mostly backs and shadows, but one figure made me pause. Without hesitation, I stormed into Adrian's office, this time unchallenged. He lounged in his chair, lifting his eyes as if my arrival had been expected. "Did you have Trin's boy beaten?" I demanded. "Don't deny it. I saw Lao Wu in the photo." He did not deny, only said he hadn't known the kid's name. Then why, I pressed, why attack someone you don't even know? My voice shook as I asked if it was because of me, or was I imagining? Adrian's gaze held mine, without flinching, his expression maddeningly calm. "Not imagination," he said. "Just your lack of sense. Madeline, do you really think everyone around you is harmless? Since when did you forget to guard yourself? Today, he dared hug you. Tomorrow, what would he dare? Must I teach you something so basic? His words cut deeper than any slap because they sounded less like jealousy than like inevitability, as though violence was the only language he trusted to protect me. I stared at him, breath caught, wondering if I had ever truly known him at all. We stared at each other, his unyielding defiance pressing against my cold detachment, neither of us willing to give ground. I broke the silence first, asking what any of this had to do with him. He frowned as if I had struck him. Adrian Turner. I said firmly, my life has nothing to do with you anymore. Stop interfering. He had bought the mansion directly across from mine, and after I caught him secretly watching me, he no longer bothered to hide it. He stood at his gate, openly greeting me as if we were still connected. I ran into him in places I never expected, even at a charity gala where he took a glass from my hand and refused it on my behalf, his interference so public, my expression grew darker each time. At last, I struck first, wresting several important projects from him. He called me then, his voice carrying a trace of amusement. "Are you still angry?" "Adrian," I snapped, "if you're sick, go see a doctor. Don't perform your circus in front of me." He clicked his tongue, ready to say more, but I hung up. Melissa Cruz came to see me one afternoon, waiting from 2 until 8, until finally she stood in front of my car, refusing to be ignored. I looked at her with indifference, while her eyes brimmed with tears and determination. "I love Adrian," she said. "This is the first time I've ever loved someone like this. He saved me, cared for me, tended to my illness. I thought he loved me too, though he never touched me, only watched me with that quiet devotion. I thought he was cautious because of my health, but it was because I reminded him of you." "Wasn't it?" Tears slid down her cheeks as she cried harder. "You and he broke up. I thought I had a chance, and even if I had to be your replacement, I didn't care. But do you know how many times he has called me by your name? When drunk, when waking from nightmares, when looking at my back? Again and again he called for you. 'I give up Madeline. I'll return him to you.' Exhaustion seeped into me then, not in my body, but deep in my soul. 'What promises did he give you?' I asked her. 'Without his arrangement, you would never have met me.' She trembled, recalling how he had placed her in his bed, her body shaking as she pleaded, reaching for him, but he pushed her away coldly. 'Don't degrade yourself,' he told her. She collapsed in sobs. 'If you don't love me, why did you care for me? Why protect me? Why cut ties with Madeline for me? You clearly had feelings, why this now?' Adrian had been silent for a long time before he finally answered. 'The way you play piano is like her, but she was injured and cannot play anymore. The way you shielded me from a blade is also like her. Beyond that, you are more obedient, more pliant. I thought you were the better choice, but perhaps I was wrong. Melissa, go find Madeline for me. If you do, I promise you'll never want for anything again.' She asked, what if she refused, and dread filled her as though a snake had lifted its tongue to strike her throat. For 9 days, I avoided Adrian. That evening, returning home, I saw him on the balcony of the mansion across the street, waving cheerfully. I ignored him, dragging my suitcase toward the car. He blocked me with his own vehicle. 'Move,' I ordered. 'No, we need to talk.' 'There's nothing to say.' 'Then drive over me,' he said, 'just like when you thought I meant to run you down.' His brows tightened. 'You have to understand, I was only threatening. I never intended to truly hurt you.' I inhaled deeply. Cold air biting my chest. 'Adrian,' I told him, 'I don't believe you. Just as you have never believed me. We should have severed ties completely, lived the rest of our lives without connection. When had our trust collapsed? If I traced it back, it had already been long, long ago. When I began taking over responsibilities at the company, learning how to manage and negotiate my way of thinking started to shift. At that time, Adrian wanted to dive into a high-risk investment with the promise of enormous profit. I begged him not to lay out the risks in careful detail, but he refused to hear me. He even accused me asking whether I was afraid of him succeeding or afraid of him failing. The words lit fire under my skin. In anger, I told him that if he dared move forward, even if he succeeded, I could strip everything from him until he was left with nothing. My father had once told me that men do not like women who are too strong, that the higher they climb, the more they want to keep everything under their control. I never believed that. I thought Adrian and I would be the exception. Later, I realized we were no different from countless ordinary people repeating the same mistakes. 2 days later, I returned from a business trip, collapsed on my bed, and slept without knowing how long until the shrill of my phone yanked me awake. His voice rasped through the line. "Madeline, my house is on fire. Can you save me? If you don't come, I'll burn alive." My mind exploded. I staggered to the window and saw flames raging from the mansion across the street. Without shoes, I bolted down the stairs, nearly falling headlong, calling emergency services, begging for help. I called Charles, telling him Adrian was trying to kill himself to come handle the aftermath. When they pulled Adrian out, he was conscious, his hand gripping mine with desperate strength, his voice hoarse. "You weren't coming." I froze, my voice lower than his. "Adrian, once you asked if she could take a blade for you." "Could I?" "I told you I couldn't, but it wasn't just words. At 18, I threw myself into danger for you without thought. Now all I do is calculate risk and measure loss. A psychologist once told me the only constant is change. That you once loved me with everything, and now love has faded, is not contradiction. It doesn't mean the past was a lie. But what about me? Has my love for you truly never waned? Adrian spent a week in the hospital, and I never visited once. I moved closer to the office, further from him. Later, I joined a mobile medical mission organized by Charles's hospital. We traveled by bus across rugged roads, visiting remote villages, offering free checkups. We saw every kind of person. A young doctor complained that an old woman insisted she was sick, though her numbers were stronger than his. I smiled faintly. People at a certain age begin to fear death. "Do you?" he asked. "Not anymore," I said. "I didn't fear it in my 20s either," he replied. "And now?" "A little," I admitted. Charles called mid-journey, asking when I would return. "You don't have to go the whole route." He said, "Doesn't your company need you? If everything requires you, then your staff is useless." "Will you answer Adrian's calls? His condition isn't good." "I'm afraid something will happen. After all, wasn't everything between you two about Melissa? Adrian didn't cross a line. At worst, he repaid a debt. Give him a chance," Charles urged. "So many years together, isn't it a shame?" But now, even hearing Adrian's name weighted my chest like stone. The night of the fire, I had stood outside, heat searing my skin, my body trembling. I was afraid. Years earlier, he had carried me from flames, telling me not to fear, though I knew he was shaking too. It had been our shared nightmare. Now he had chosen to repeat it. Was it to push me or prove something? I didn't want to dig. I didn't want to think. Our relationship had become unspeakable, undefined. The next time I saw him was in a small village where we had stopped with the medical team. I had just finished eating when he appeared leaning against a tree, his face drawn thin. He kept his distance close, but not too close, following quietly as though tethered by some invisible cord. A young doctor asked if he was my friend, just someone I know. I replied. Adrian said nothing, and no one spoke to him. Yet when he saw people burdened, he stepped forward to help silent and capable. Still, his cold demeanor made them uneasy, as if he carried with him a storm that could never settle. 4 quiet days passed before he finally knocked on the door of my hotel room. Perhaps both of us had been stretched to our limits. I moved aside without a word and let him in. The first thing Adrian said was, "I'm sorry." I exhaled, feeling the weight inside me slip loose with the breath. "Then you should stay away from me." "I can't," he answered. Adrian Turner. "What do you want from me?" His eyes were hollow with exhaustion. "I want to be with you. I want us to start again." "That's impossible." "Then what if I insist?" "If it were Melissa, you could bind her with 100 chains, but I am not her." "Adrian, you can't force me, and if you try, I will cut you off completely." His phone rang, and at the same moment mine did too. Ethan's voice was calm on the other end. "It's done." I murmured acknowledgement and looked at Adrian. His face drained of color, silent. Ethan's action was warning enough my way of telling Adrian to keep his distance. He staggered to his feet, lips twisting into a broken smile. "Everyone tells me not to do things I'll regret." Later, I didn't believe them. Madeline. I regret it now. No one knew what he regretted. Was it Melissa, or the years we had grown apart, or being with me at all, or even meeting me in the first place? No one could know. Life returned to its pattern. Adrian and I barely saw each other. Charles never mentioned him again, though sometimes he would hesitate as if he wanted to speak, then sigh and fall silent. My father called with a voice dripping satisfaction. "So it's over." "Really? Over no reconciliation. I told you 2 would never last. Madeline, you're tougher than both your parents put together." I laughed. "Father, you talk of toughness as though you ever had it. You're nothing but selfish, always loving only yourself." He was quiet for a while. "And you think Adrian isn't the same, including you too. Did you ever really believe parents like us could raise children capable of real love? Ridiculous." He was right, our families had been devoid of tenderness, for Adrian even more so. After separating from my father, Adrian's mother had chased wealthy men. She courted many, casting her net wide, in hopes of catching one great fish. When she became pregnant, she thought the child would bind her to power. She waited until it was too late for an abortion before confronting the man she had chosen. She did not even know who the father truly was, so she picked the richest and most powerful among them. But before she could win anything, she was thrown out by the man's wife. The dream of marrying into fortune died, and she gave birth to the child with bitterness that she poured on him every day. Later, she and my father crossed paths again. Later, Adrian and I met. Perhaps neither of us ever knew how to love. But both of us always hoped to be loved. Perhaps we hoped too much, expected too much, and in the end, only despair remained. A year and a half later, Adrian died. I was in a meeting when my secretary leaned close and whispered the news. For 2 seconds, my body froze. Then I signaled for the meeting to continue. That day, I made no mistake at work. That night, I sat on the balcony wrapped in a blanket for hours. Charles told me it was cancer discovered too late already, at the final stage incurable, and he hadn't wanted treatment. "I'm sorry, Madeline," he said gently. Ethan ran in breathless, stopping short behind me without stepping closer. "I never thought he would die. Whatever fights, whatever breaks, he should have lived to grow old. Tell me, why do people cling to life when it hurts so much?" I had no answer. Ethan's voice was heavy. "I only know that if you live, you must live well. When the day comes to leave, at least it won't be wasted." I fell into a heavy illness, fevered and delirious for a week. Charles and Ethan stayed by my side in shifts. "You weren't afraid I'd kill myself?" I asked them. "You worry too much," they said. "As Ethan told you, if you live well. When the time truly comes, at least you will not have wasted a lifetime." People, no matter how many detours they take, in the end, only know how to love themselves and can only ever love themselves. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next videos.